everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation about Zoom fatigue. We're here with Dr. Natalia David. She's a psychologist here at UT Southwestern, and thank you so much, Dr. David, for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're excited to talk about this. I know that everybody is, kind of adjusting to this new normal of having to connect with people virtually. What are you seeing with, patients or as a trend across the board when it comes to video chats and having to be so connected to our screens all the time?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's becoming even more and more and more important as we've kind of been thrust into this unconsented, impromptu social experiment that we're all in right now, with trying to navigate the unknown terrains of delivering adequate, whether it's telemedicine or teletherapy or just connecting with friends. How do we do that in this virtual environment? And so it's definitely been a challenge, I think, for a lot of providers to be able to deliver adequate care to their patients. And then in normal conversation and interactions with people, you really lose a lot of the essence of that when you're doing it virtually. So that's been, from what I've seen, what the research is saying now is that we're really losing some of those really important elements of normal communication.
Yeah, like what kind of elements do you think are important that we're kind of missing out on when we are connecting with people virtually?
So the normal mechanisms of conversation and interactions, we lose a lot of the unconscious and processes that our brains are picking up on that we're not even aware of. 70% of communication is body language. And while we're still face to face, we still miss out on the normal body cues that we get with people, or even if we're in a room with people, reading the room kind of a thing. And so we have to work a lot harder to navigate some of those elements. We have to work a lot harder to stay focused, have sustained attention, maintain eye contact, appear engaged, more than we normally would when we're in person. And so that really becomes really taxing on the brain and really fatiguing. And, the elements of equity and reciprocity in a normal conversation, they just get really diminished when you're on a video call.
Yeah, so I know we're sitting here and it's kind of ironic. What do you think we're missing out on just by not being face to face today?
So humans have a tendency to mirror the person that they're speaking to or try to reflect them in some way, and it's a unconscious behavior that we all engage in and to try to connect with another person. And so our bodies do this really kind of subconsciously, and when we're missing that element of a person right in front of us talking to us, that creates a lot of dissonance. And so I think that whether or not it's kind of mind-body dissonance or like you and me dissonance, there's still a gap there of like this kind of filled space that people try to fill. And then that's the part that becomes really fatiguing and taxing, is that we overperform and we overdo. And when you're doing this multiple times throughout the day, and then you have happy hour, virtual social meetups at the end of the day too, that can also be really hard to kind of transition over to that when you're already fatigued.
Absolutely. Well, we actually have our first question that came in. It's from Amy, and she wants to know, what are some tips to communicate in the most efficient way in a Zoom team meeting?
That's a great question. I don't know if anybody has seen there's a lot of really funny commercials out there nowadays that they're creating with these Zoom calls, and you'll have people with the vacuum on and the baby crying in the background, and we've all heard about the video or Zoom blunders, right? About people things happening with medias. And so I think that raises some anxiety and self-consciousness and self-criticism and a lot of other negative emotions that accompany those things for someone who's presenting in a kind of a large Zoom meeting, and you have all these little boxes of faces staring at you, and so there's some anxiety there as well. What we know in general, when you're missing out on some of those body cues, being slow and concise in the language that you use can really help to get your point across a little bit better. Um, Also prefacing the beginning of the meeting with, if there's a break in our conversation, just kind of hang on tight, because those can raise a lot of anxieties for people when they're thinking if there's some technological issue going on, when it's just a normal kind of a pause or a break in a conversation and a time for processing and for people to think. We can automatically jump to, is there something wrong? Do I need to fix it?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we have another question that just came in from Kristen. She says, I may have missed this, but why do Zooms and video chats make us so tired?
Yeah, great. We just talked about that. So, lots of different reasons. One is that we have to overperform and try really harder at staying focused, at staying engaged with whether it's one person or multiple people that we're Zooming in or video conferencing in with, picking up on subtle tones in their voice rather than using our perception of body language to fill the gaps is another taxing um, event that occurs. And also, we just lose the natural empathy that we have. I talked about this kind of mirroring effect that humans tend to do, and we lose that. And so, empathy goes along with it. And if you can imagine trying to have a really difficult conversation with someone over video, that gets amplified even a little bit more. You're trying to connect with someone, and it just makes it harder.
Yeah, so, it is hard. And then we have learners too, which is another question we just got in. So, people are transitioning to having to teach online, and learners are having to learn virtually. So there's that disconnection happening. So Rana asked, are there any tips for teaching when you're using Zoom if the learners have become tired of it as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially in our more than likely distance learning continuing for the fall. And so our children don't have as good ability to fill those gaps that I just mentioned about body language and that reciprocity that normally happens. That emotional regulation and cognitive regulation is not there for children. And so they're easily distracted, and it becomes harder on the teacher to kind of keep them engaged. Frequent breaks, just like you might do with recess, is something that's going to be really important for distance learning, or even during like a conference call at work. We naturally take breaks when we're in a meeting, whether it's a coffee break or a bathroom break, and we get up and we walk around, or we're kind of, going from one side of the room to the other, or the blackboard. That becomes a lot harder. We know research says that movement enhances creativity and performance and decision making abilities. And so, if there's some movement element built into the virtual classroom, whether it's let's get up and do a stretch or a couple of jumping jacks or something to just keep the kids or people engaged as much as possible and um, get that movement going that we normally would have in a natural environment.
Okay, and we have another question that just came in from Ruth. You had talked about how we kind of become self-conscious a little bit with having to worry about how we're looking or how we're presenting ourselves. This question is somewhat related to that. Is there a way to give leaders some guidance to stop judging people for their online expressions? I think sometimes during meetings, people, don't always look like they're smiling because they're just focused. And I think that really comes through on video sometimes. But it's not that they're upset, and it's not that they're in a bad mood, but they're just, they just have their neutral face on, and that can come off a certain way through video. So how can we, as leaders, provide some guidance for people in the business world to be more welcoming in that environment, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a great question. So interestingly, we know that we tend to make negative attributions about people based on facial expressions and also based on external circumstances. So it might not just be a facial expression or and someone's perceiving their disengagement, right? It might be something going on in the background. If you have one of those like virtual backgrounds too and it flickers, right, that creates a little bit of disruption in someone's concentration levels. That can be perceived as negatively. And so this thing called the primacy effect says that those initial negative attributions that we make about someone tend to stick around, even if they're disproven later on in that phone call or conversation or video conference. Um, yeah, and so um, I think we all would say that most people have been a little bit more lenient with some of the challenges, the Zoom challenges, or what they're calling like Zoom doom these days. Um, but again, I think it's still going to require us going forward to just be a little bit more relaxed or ask people how are their if you can't read their facial expressions that well, then just ask them. I know sometimes in a normal setting we wouldn't have to like raise our hand and do that kind of thing, and that's become an issue with online calls where we have to call on people. That's another way to get people engaged is to have a raise your hand function, or to specifically call someone out if you need to ask them a question, just to get that engagement better.
Okay, those are all great tips. We have another question that just came in. Kristen's asking, she says, I'm on so many Zoom calls that I sometimes have trouble falling asleep because I am thinking about them at night. Any tips to help late night Zoomers? And I know you're a sleep specialist, so I bet you have some interesting tips for this one.
Yeah. So, this has really changed. Zooming has really changed a lot of our culture right now, and it'll be interesting in the future to know how we go back to normalcy, or how we incorporate Zoom and other video conferencing platforms into our day to day. But there's a great deal of stimulation and arousal that's going on right now, and before Zoom, there's the sleep hygiene tips of decrease that pre-sleep arousal in order to give yourself some time to relax and be prepared for sleep. If you're overloaded with stimulation and screen time, and then you're watching television and you're on your phone and you're just getting bombarded with all of this screen time, that arousal is going to be really, really high. And so the same kind of technology hygiene is warranted here, which is limit screen time as much as you can in other arenas. If you find yourself on your computer zooming a lot, then don't watch as much TV or try not to do as much social media. And leave that a buffer of about 2 hours before bed for that. That way you decrease that activation in your brain. You're not getting all that light stimulation, and that'll help you fall asleep a little bit faster.
Great tips. We have a lot of good questions coming in. Rick's asking, I've heard about things like caution fatigue during COVID-19, where people just decide they're tired of being safe and they just kind of stop taking precautions. Does Zoom fatigue fit into this in any way, where we just stop wanting to turn on our video during Zoom calls, or stop caring if we come off, or stop caring how we come off in a video conference?
Yeah, that's really a great question. Definitely caution fatigue has been, I think a lot higher the last few weeks, and we can see that in the number of COVID cases that are rising, with people kind of giving up or just being tired of taking those precautions. And yes, absolutely. So one strategy to mitigate that is by limiting Zoom calls or video calls as much as you can, and going back to old school telephone audio only. If you are on a Zoom call with a lot of people, turn your video camera off. That reduces the kind of self judgment that you're doing, the overperforming that you have to give, we feel obligated to like stay engaged and be focused. And so it can reduce some of that. The one thing though, I would say to caution about that is sometimes people think that, oh, I can be on the Zoom call and listen and do something else at the same time.
Mm.
And so multitasking then becomes another issue. But what we know about multitasking is that it actually reduces performance by about 40%. And so
Wow.
we definitely want to be careful of not to then overdo it because we're already on this call, we're trying to pay attention to that, and we're trying to focus on something else. So in that sense, like there can definitely be this like caution with avoiding some of those challenges that inherently come from using some of these platforms. Did I answer that question thoroughly?
Yes, that was
Okay.
great. I mean, I know it helped me understand. So, Rick, if you have any follow-up questions, just feel free to drop those in the comment section. We have another question from Ruth. She says, how about the ways being on video is a challenge for people who are neurodiverse?
Neurodiverse. Say a little bit more about that.
I'm not sure what exactly she's asking. So perhaps, Ruth, you can expand on that in the comments and we'll move on to our next question and come back. So we have another question from Paul. Paul says, I enjoy winding down with music on YouTube. Is that okay?
Are you watching videos on YouTube? If you are, then it might be a little bit more taxing, unless it's something really relaxing like watching the rainfall or, watching a ocean or I don't know, the rainforest or something. That can be relaxing and kind of mundane. And so you're not really performing in a sense. So I would say that if it's something that gives you pleasure and it relaxes you, I would say that's totally okay to do.
Do you think the act of, searching for a video on YouTube can increase that feeling of Zoom fatigue or screen fatigue,
Yeah.
however we want to call it, even if we're getting to that place of listening to music that calms us down?
Yeah, I definitely do think that the web browsing, right, can definitely cause some fatigue there because we're bombarded with other messages. There's ads that pop up. Our attention is going from one thing to another. So our brains are still working really hard during that time. And unless you have something on your specialist that you could just kind of click on that you already know is going to be calming and relaxing for you, spending a lot of time searching for that can kind of undo what you're trying to do in the first place.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, everybody, you have asked many great questions so far. We just have a few minutes left with Dr. David before we have to let her get back to her day. So if you have any questions, make sure you're dropping those in the comment section. We'll get to as many as we can. As I was saying, you've gotten to so much great information today. I have a question about how can we stay connected to people and do that in a way that's safe without, spreading COVID or catching it ourselves. Video seems to be the best tool for that, but how can we do this in a way that isn't going to totally wipe us out by the end of the day? When we do have to also tend to these video calls during work, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so the wonderful thing about technology and Zoom is that it has given us the opportunity to stay connected and to keep our jobs, right? To have food on the table and a roof over our heads. And so we're all really grateful for the abilities and capabilities of technology these days in that respect. One way we can be better Zoomers is by trying to provide yourself with um, some boundaries with that respect. Boundaries meaning that there are boundaries in the amount of Zoom or extra, personal Zoom calls that you're on or that you do, that you put some limitations on that just to preserve some of that energy and not get as fatigued. And the other thing is that social complexity theory states that we are we have social roles that are mitigated by our environment. And so, at work, we're in one environment and we assume a role. We come home when we're with family or when we're out with friends. And with those boundaries being really blurred right now, having better transitions between your Zoom calls with friends and family versus work, going to another room, dedicating a room if you have just for like personal stuff versus work stuff. And also just, creating that kind of environmental scaffold that we need to just provide some separation in space and let us assume those roles as we would more naturally. I think that is a part of this Zoom fatigue that gets overlooked is just the role of physical space and our ability to be fatigued or not fatigued.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we do have a follow-up question from Ruth. She says, I'm an adult educator and I recognize that adult learners like children have various cognitive challenges such as ADHD, autism spectrum, etc. For many, then having their camera on and trying to look at faces can be even more cognitively challenging. So she's asking for tips.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great thing that I think we all need to be paying attention to is for people who do suffer from attentional issues or difficulties and how difficult it is for them and how much more taxing it is for them. I'm not sure if on a Zoom call you can minimize as a host the number of people that you're looking at, or you can only see or take the camera off of yourself and only see the presenter. But those might be some technology strategies to use to decrease the level of distraction that a lot of kids with ADHD or that are on the spectrum might get from either inwardly thinking about how they're performing on camera or just being distracted by what other people are doing.
All right. We have another question. Are there ways that video chats are beneficial?
Absolutely. So, I just mentioned that technology has really given us that opportunity to stay connected. And especially in this world of kind of quarantine and social isolation, it has allowed us. I'm sorry about that. I just got a call. To carry on with our normal interactions and interpersonal relationships. And so it's allowed us to stay connected, even though it's with accommodation and to a small degree. It allows us to, have those relationships. We may not be kind of fostering new relationships at this time, but that's okay. And so I definitely think that Zoom has given us an opportunity to do that.
Wonderful. Well, we are just about ready to wrap up. We're just out of time. Is there anything that we haven't asked you today that you wanted to cover during this chat, or anything that you think would be valuable for our audience to know?
One thing that we didn't really mention that I think is a great tip and strategy to use is, we mentioned having natural breaks throughout our day or even in our Zoom calls. And we talked about the role of physical environment being really important. And so even if it's just spending a few minutes and logging into a call early, I know that might sound counterintuitive to what we've been talking about, but spending time catching up with friends or asking, just like you normally would if you went into the conference room and you saw your buddies or colleagues and you just kind of catch up for a few minutes. And I don't think we're spending time doing that nowadays. So that contributes to some of the isolation and fatigue. Versus if we try as much as we can to have some blended conversations in there, it might help to just reduce some of the fatigue and energy that we're expending in trying to stay focused for that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. David. This has been fascinating. You always provide such great insight for us, so we sure appreciate you giving us your time this afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you to everybody. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But thank you to everybody that joined us today and asked such great questions. You can continue putting those questions in the comments box, and we'll get those over to Dr. David. This chat will be available here and on YouTube later today. So if you want to reference it or share it with your friends, we would love for you to do that. But thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.